I can hear you. Can you see me? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, everyone. Welcome to today's Levy Lecture. My name is Wendy Cromash, and I am delighted to see you all here. We have about 500 people signed up for today's lecture, and they could not have made a better decision. We are going to have the pleasure of Robert Watson's company for at least an hour and a half, and we are in for a treat. So let me get through our announcements, which are very brief, and we'll include an introduction to Dr. Watson, and then I will let him take the platform, and I will see you on the other side in an hour for the Q&A. So first of all, we want to thank the Levy Senior Center Foundation. Without the foundation and your support of the foundation, we would not be able to present these free lectures. So thank you, Levy Senior Center Foundation. Let me tell you about Dr. Watson. He is an award-winning author of over 40 books and 200 scholarly articles and essays on topics in history and politics, as well as 2 multi-edition, multi-volume encyclopedia sets on the presidents and first ladies. He's won numerous awards in books. His books have been published internationally, and he's been featured at prominent literary festivals across the country. He's a frequent media commentator. He's been interviewed thousands of times on news outlets around the world, including CNN, MSNBC, USA Today, the New York Times, NPR, and the BBC. He's appeared on Hardball with Chris Matthews, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, C-SPAN's American History TV, and the Washington Journal. Dr. Watson has co-convened several national conferences, co-founded the annual Truman Legacy Symposium for the Truman Presidential Library, and served on the boards of numerous academic associations, community organizations, and the Harry S. Truman Foundation. He served on the Calvin Coolidge Foundation and the George McGovern Center for Leadership. Watson has also served as the editor of the scholarly journal, White House Studies, the assistant editor and the book review editor for the Social Science Journal, and the Presidency series editor for the State University of New York Press. He's also been a visiting scholar or lecturer with such historic sites as the Truman Presidential Institution, the Pentagon, Museum of the American Revolution Institute, Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, National Museum of the US Navy, George Washington's Mount Vernon, Society of the Cincinnati, James Mattis's Montpelier, Francis Tavern Museum, and the Truman Little White House, to name a few. He's also one of few historians selected every few years to rank the presidents. As a community leader, Professor Watson has hosted many voter registration drives, mock elections, civic education programs for schools, and workshops for social studies teachers. He's co-founded 3 nonprofits dedicated to civic engagement, political reform, and fact-checking political ads. He's given over 2,000 lectures to libraries, museums, historic sites, community groups, and corporate conventions around the world. And he has led many historic sites around the US and internationally. Those are study tours. He's the recipient of many awards for his contributions to the study of the presidency, election commentary, community service, and civics programs, and efforts to combat anti-Semitism and incivility. He's also been inducted to 2 Sports Hall of Fame. A fellow Pennsylvanian, he was born in Harrisburg, attended public schools in nearby Hershey, and was educated at Virginia Tech, where he lettered in football and track. He holds the titles of Distinguished Professor of American History, Avron Fogelman Research Professor and Director of Project Civitas at Lynn University, and the Senior Fellow with Senator Bob Graham's Florida Joint Center for Citizenship. He's the proud father of 2 children. Dr. Watson, it is beyond a pleasure. Thank you so much. We are here at your undivided attention, and as I said before, I will see you in an hour and moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Wendy.
Take it away. Sure.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for the kind words and introduction. And off camera, Wendy and I had a real nice conversation. I quite enjoyed it. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm now going to share the screen for everybody. Let me know if you can see that okay, and hope that works. There, I shared the screen. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I wish I was there in person. I enjoy Chicago and that entire area where you are. I had the pleasure of speaking several times in the area, universities, museums. I was at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and just south of your city and at Temple Anshe Shalom a few times. So pleasure to be here. So I'm also excited because I love Harry Truman. He's one of my heroes for sure. And I think whenever we get a little frustrated with politics or we get a little jaded with elected officials, it's always a good thing to remember Harry Truman. They broke the mold with the guy. So before I jump into Truman, let me just share a couple of cute stories with you. I had the pleasure of about 25 years ago, I looked up and then rounded up all the living advisors to Harry Truman, secretaries, generals, speech writers, aides, and I conducted over a several year period oral history interviews with them, whereby I sat and interviewed them and sent the videotapes to the Truman Presidential Library, and also raised money to bring all of them back together again, and so they could all meet. And I interviewed them there. So I had a wonderful opportunity. But what I gained from that was some really fun stories. So let me share with you just a couple stories to just show how common Harry Truman was. And he was utterly unaffected, utterly unimpacted by his success and the fact that he was the president of the United States. He treated everyone with dignity, everybody with respect. And no matter how lowly you were in the White House or government, he wanted to say hello and know your name. He also had a photographic memory, which is apparent in this first brief story I'll share with you. So I interviewed one of his secretaries. Her name was Wanda, and she wasn't his main secretary. She was one of several that sat off to the side in a, cubicles doing a lot of the phone and letter answering and typing, that kind of a thing. And one day she said, Truman came walking by, talking to some advisors, and she had that morning brought in a new photograph of her son. I can't remember her son's name or age, but let's say it was John, and he was 8. So Truman walks by, and she's just off to the side, just one of many secretaries. And she said to me, I almost fell out of my chair because I hear the president yell, Wanda. And she said, I couldn't imagine that he knew my name. And she looked and she said, me? He said, yeah, Wanda, is that a new photograph on your desk? He noticed. And she said, well, yes, Mr. President. He said, well, who is it? She said, it's my son. He said, well, what's his name? Come on. She said, it's John. He said, well, he's a handsome young man. How old is John? She said, John's 8. Well, he's not 8, but he'll be 8 in another 9 weeks on, September 25th or whatever it was. And he said, well, tell John that Harry said hi. And he laughed and then went into his office. And she told me, she said, I couldn't believe that exchange. Well, you all know where this is going, right, everybody? She then said to me 9 weeks later, on September 25th or whenever the date was, Truman is walking through the offices and she's over in the corner just, doing her work and looking at him. She says that when he gets to his door, he stops and turns around and yells across the whole area. He yells, Wanda. He says, today is John's birthday. And she said, yes, Mr. President. He said, well, tell him that Harry said happy birthday. Then he went into his office. Here he is running the world. But he remembered one of many secretaries, her little boy's birthday. But that's Truman. I go to the Truman Library every year and I interview these aides and I know the archivists, and I always ask them to find their favorite letter in the library or their favorite story and then share it with me so then I could, of course, enjoy it and share it with all of you. And here's a cute one. There was a man, Truman is retired. He's living at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. This is after his presidency, he's retired. And a man, his car breaks down the road. So, of course, I tell my students that they didn't have cell phones back then, which my students have no idea how we ever made it. And the man comes and knocks on Truman's door and asked if he could borrow his phone to call a tow truck. And Truman says, yes, sure, come on in. The man makes the call, and then while he's leaving, Truman says to him, look, it'll be a few minutes. Why don't you have a seat and get out of the sun? And he gets him a glass of iced tea. The man has no idea who Truman is.
All right,
So
I'll
they
call you
sit
in
and
an hour.
talk,
Bye.
and they just shoot the breeze for a while. And then as the man is leaving, the man walks out the front door and out the porch, and he's walking down these steps, and he says, Truman walks out onto the porch and says, have a good day. He walks out on the porch to wave goodbye to this fellow. And before the man walks to his car to meet the tow truck, he turns around to Truman and says, quote unquote, did anyone ever tell you that you look just like that son of a bee, Harry Truman? And Truman says to him, yeah, I get that all the time. And then he waves and the man left. Well, sometime later, the man realized, oh my goodness, that was Harry Truman. So he wrote a letter to the library just begging apologies. Another cute one, there was a young couple, and they, for their honeymoon, they were doing one of these Americana tours. They were driving across Route 66 and just through the heartland. And they stopped at Truman's home. Now, today, this is impossible with the Secret Service and fencing and motion detectors and, but back then you could just walk up to Truman's house. And so they stop and they walk up, and the woman hands the husband her camera, and she steps up on Truman's porch and tells him to quick take a photograph, as if she's walking into Truman's house. The woman writes this letter to the Truman Library later on, and she says, I'm standing there on the porch, and to my horror, she said, the front door opened and there stands the President of the United States. And she said, I thought my husband and I were going to go to jail, that the Secret Service was going to arrest us. She said, instead, Truman walks out and says, now here, give me the camera. And he says, why don't you just go ahead in the house and pretend like you're walking out and let me get that photo for you. So he must have been listening to them. So she said he takes a picture of him, and then he tells them, sit on my front porch, and he takes a picture with them there, and he's snapping all these photos. Then he hands them the camera, and she said when she and her husband went walking out to the car, he walks down to the edge of the sidewalk, and he's giving them directions on how to go and where to get out of here, and he's waving as they drive away. He's standing out like your aunt or your grandmother or something, standing out along the road waving as they drive away. And the woman says in her letter, she says that was the most surreal thing that ever happened to her. The problem, of course, is Truman never took photographs, and he was a terrible photographer. So he ends up inadvertently cutting their heads off on all the photos, but they sure did have a good story. So I was talking with Wendy earlier about the politics today, and how Truman would rather do the right thing and lose than do the wrong thing and win, which is just something you don't equate with politics or leaders these days. And I just wanted to give you an example. I had asked a lot of these aides if Truman ever made them laugh or cry or angry or happy or whatever. And when we were talking about it, whenever Truman made them angry, one of them said that, yeah, we were having a fundraiser in 1948. And of course, money back then is not like money today. And you didn't have to raise much money to run for office back then. Today, it's prohibitive. But there was a $5,000 program. And the aides were all frustrated because Truman would not go. They said, Mr. President, you don't understand. You're going to lose in 1948. Every poll, everybody, every analyst, everybody knew Truman was going to lose and Dewey was going to win in a landslide. So they said, we need every penny we can get so that you have a chance. Also, you're going to bring the entire Democratic Party down with you in that election, which happened in the 1946 midterm, by the way. So they're trying to get Truman to go to the fundraiser, and he won't go, he won't go, and he won't go. And finally, they say to him, Mr. President, you don't understand. It's $5,000, which was a lot of money. And Truman turned around to them and he looked at them and said, quote unquote, no, you don't understand. It's not $5,000. If I win, it's 5,000 IOUs and I'm not for sale. And he didn't go to the fundraiser. I mean, which again is almost quaint from today's perspectives. So here we go. Harry, there's young Harry, one of the earliest pictures. He was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri. He would end up being the last president to lack a college degree. So Truman did not have a college degree, grew up on a farm. The family struggled, middle class to middle lower class, depending on how the farm was doing and the economy was doing. So when Harry grew up, he had a couple of dreams. One of them was he wanted to go in the war. He wanted to join the military, I should say. He wanted to go to West Point. That was always one of his dreams. The problem for Truman, he was darn near blind. He had terrible eyesight. And when he ultimately goes into World War I, he wrote and said that he took so many pair of glasses in every pocket, in his rucksack, everywhere there was an extra pair of glasses, because if something happened to his, he was in trouble. So the problem for Truman, he couldn't get into West Point. He didn't have the contacts, plus he couldn't see. He sure was going to have trouble getting into World War I. So, you have to take an eye test. So Truman goes to take his eye test, and he's really worried about it because without his glasses, he won't be able to see the eye chart. So there's two other men with him, young men, going to take the eye chart, so the eye test. So Truman says, why don't the two of you go first? And he lets them go first. Remember, I said Truman has a photographic memory, much like Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin. So Truman's photographic. And what he does is he listens to the two men read the eye chart, and he memorizes on the spot the entire eye chart. So when it was time to walk in, when the physician said, okay, Truman just from memory just goes, brrr, read the whole eye chart. So he passed and got to go into World War I. There's Captain Harry. He became a captain, rose to the lofty ranks of captain, the Missouri Artillery, Battery D. He was in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And if anyone knows anything about World War I, that was the big battle, critical turning point battle and a bloodbath. And during the war, Truman distinguishes himself with bravery and valor. He one time, and when they're knee deep in mud, and the Army's not able to go and reinforce a unit that was in jeopardy of being overrun by the Germans, Truman asked permission to break out of formation and break out of line, and he's given permission. He and his men get 4 of the cannons. They hook up all the horses and mules, and Truman joins his men. They're on their knees pushing the thing through the mud, and they roll these cannons up on a hill. And the purpose was they wanted to provide fire and cover for the Americans who were at risk of being surrounded and overrun. So Truman does that and orders fire rain down on the German positions to hold them off long enough to save these men. At one point, a group of Germans were advancing on Truman's 4 cannons, his howitzers, and Truman's men are turning to cut and run. It's just a couple of artillerymen with sidearms against the German infantry unit. They said some of the men had recorded that Truman ran after the men. They said that they all learned new cuss words that day from Captain Harry. And Truman threatened to shoot every darn one of them with a sidearm if they don't get back to those cannons and man the cannons. There was a tense standoff between Truman and his men. And then Truman says, well, then I'll go fire the cannons. He goes back. He's going to load and fire the 4 cannons in the face of an oncoming infantry unit. His bravery inspired his men, who then fired the cannons and held off that advance. So Truman emerges as a hero during the war. The other thing Truman wanted to do, in addition to going to West Point and joining the military, which he would have the opportunity, Truman wanted to be either an historian or an architect. The fact that he wanted to be an historian means he had to be a good guy, right? What a job. So Truman wanted to be an historian or architect. He ultimately gets the chance, and that comes when the White House needs to be renovated. Truman had to move out of the White House for quite some time, and they did a complete, not just renovation, but restoration, where they gutted the building. What happened was the White House had been burned on August 24th, 1814 by the British. Subsequent, there was another fire. They added a 3rd floor. These are wooden beams. The ceiling was actually sagging. And the White House was in such a situation by the 40s when Truman entered it. And of course, it was neglected for the 12 years under FDR because of the Depression, the war, and so many other more pressing matters, that Truman was worried that the building was going to collapse. And he would write that that the White House was haunted. He said, because when somebody was on the second floor, the chandeliers on the first floor would sway. And the building had buckled enough that some of the doors wouldn't shut tight. And he said at night it would creak and groan. He said, I always thought it was the ghost of Andy Jackson trying to talk to me, is what Truman used to laugh and say. So Truman is trying to build support to renovate and save the White House, but the Republicans defeated all the measures and wouldn't fund it. So Truman gets some leaders of Congress, the architect of the Capitol and others, to come and tour the building. He wants to show them for themselves that this building is in real, there's a real possibility that the building could collapse. And while they're walking through the building, and one of the greatest coincidences in history, there's a pile of rubble on the floor, like a construction scene. And they're looking at the rubble and thinking, why is this here? Then they look up, and the leg of Truman's piano is sticking through the ceiling. Truman was a great pianist, by the way. And the leg of the piano is sticking through the ceiling, so they laugh, and this is what he says. He says, gentlemen, this building is standing purely by habit. So they raise funds to renovate the building, a remarkable renovation. And Truman adds the Truman balcony to the building. And he got a lot of grief for it, a lot of criticism for it. The Republicans just did not let this go, making fun of him as back porch Harry, saying that he ruined the White House. What's interesting is many of the presidents that have served since of both parties have said that the Truman balcony and the view from the Truman balcony is one of their absolute favorite places in the White House. There's Elizabeth, AKA Bess Wallace, and Harry married Bess. It was the only girl he ever dated, the only girl he ever kissed, he always said. They met when they were about 5, and Harry wrote these romantic letters to Bess their entire life, and they were long-lived. Bess lived to be 97, and Harry was quite long-lived himself. And Harry would always write to Bess and tell her, even late in life, that, you know, you're the most beautiful woman. I never wanted to even kiss another girl. You're the one for me. I mean, just remarkable letters. Bess would write him back about the weather, but Harry was head over heels for Bess. It was really cute once, and he wrote her daily, like I said, and really poured his heart out in these letters. And Truman's eldest grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, and the late, great Professor Robert Farrell, noted historian, both have collected and published collections of these letters. And I recommend both the books to you. Robert Farrell, Ferrell, and Clifton Truman Daniel, Dear Harry, Dear Bess. In one of the letters, late in life, Harry writes this down. They're in retirement, and he goes walking into the living room to see Bess. And she's sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace with a shoebox filled with their love letters, apparently from the war. And she's reading a letter, so Harry doesn't interrupt her. And he very quietly sneaks around the corner and is peeking around the corner, watching this endearing scene of Bess sitting and reading the love letters written decades and decades before. And then all of a sudden, Bess throws the letters into the fireplace. And Harry screams, according to what he said, quote unquote, he yells, Bess, by God, think of history. And she says, I am. So she was very private. And, the letters that survive show Harry to be funny, honest, frank, loving, caring, head over heels for Bess. I can only imagine those that she had burned. So he courts Bess for years. She wants nothing to do with him. He's a poor, half-blind farmer boy, and her family has a little bit of money. And Bess is the smartest kid in the school and the best tennis player. So she wants nothing to do with him. Finally, they're up there in years for the time and for not being married. And finally, Harry, after years of carrying her books after school and begging, Bess finally agrees to marry him. But then World War I breaks out. So Harry says to her, I can't allow you to marry me. What if I die or come home a cripple, he wrote, quote unquote. So he said, why don't we wait until after the war, which just really bothered him. But they did finally marry, and they had one daughter, Margaret. She had 4 grandsons. Harry struggled and had several bankruptcies in his life, something that he had 3 Ulysses Grant had 3 bankruptcies, and George W. Bush drove 3 businesses into bankruptcy. Of course, Trump drove a couple dozen businesses into failure, but Truman had 3 major failures. You can see on the right there, that's Harry. That's actually him. He was a farmer for 10 years, but then the farm went belly up. He speculated for oil, didn't find a thing, sold it, lost everything. The person that bought it struck oil. There's Truman on the left with his best friend, Eddie Jacobson. Eddie and Harry were in World War I together. During their basic training, they ran a supply business on the base. And they all, like a lot of men during the war, they said, if we live through this thing, we want to open up a business together. And sure enough, they did. They opened their haberdashery. And unfortunately, it went bankrupt. Harry was 7 years Eddie's senior, so he was more like the big brother, Eddie more like the little brother in this relationship. Eddie couldn't pay off his the money he had lost, and Harry ended up covering that for Eddie. So he did struggle and had a lot of failures, and he never forgot that. I think it tempered him. I think it built into him this legendary stoicism, this attitude that he's not afraid of anything and he will overcome. So Boss Pendergast, here's an interesting story. You could argue that Truman was the most moral, most honest person ever to hold the office. I would clearly say that that's the case. The only ones that I think you could even put in a conversation with him in terms of just their honesty in the office, maybe Ulysses Grant, maybe Lincoln, maybe Teddy Roosevelt. But Truman was so honest, so honorable. But the kicker is he got his start with the head of the Kansas City mob, Boss Pendergast, Tom Pendergast. So what it was Pendergast, and there they are together, the young Harry. Pendergast wanted, there was an election for what was called a county judge. Now, not a judge like you and I know with a robe and a gavel ruling on court cases. A county judge in rural Missouri back then would be like a county administrator or city manager, somebody who would build the roads, public buildings, so forth and so on. So Pendergast says, I want some local fool, some young guy that I can manipulate, and the deal will be for every mile of road paved, I get a kickback. It's through my companies. And every building built, I get a kickback on it per brick and everything. That's what he wanted. So he's looking around for some fall guy, some stooge, and here's Truman, who comes back from World War I. Truman's uneducated, he's a failed farmer, but he was a hero in the war, so all the local men that served in his artillery unit were wild about Harry. So Truman was his guy. He picked Truman, got behind him. Truman wins. Pendergast approaches Truman about the deal. Truman never gives Pendergast as much as a penny, not a cent. Pendergast was so livid that he pushes someone to run against Truman in the next election. So that created strain in that relationship. The Truman Committee, sometimes called the Truman Commission. This was during World War II. There he is in his hearing. Truman was nonstop. He was a man on a mission. What Truman discovered was a lot of big companies were overcharging the Pentagon. You know, golden parachutes, gold plating the contracts. We all know that there's a lot of defense contracting fraud these days. I actually wrote my main master's research thesis on that topic. But Truman is livid with this fraud. And Truman used to always say that politics is the worst thing that anybody can do. But because it's so darn bad, almost all political sins are forgivable, except one, what he called wartime profiteering. When people were making money off the war, he said that's a one-way ticket to hell. So Truman had no patience for that notion of wartime profiteering. So what he does is he starts bringing all these companies before him and traveling around the country and having them audited. Hundreds of hearings, hundreds of interviews. And it's estimated that Truman saved the Pentagon and therefore the American people around $15 billion. Now that's in the 40s, everybody, during the war. So that was remarkable work. Here's a fun story I heard about the work of the Truman Committee. 2 of his aides told me. One of them shared this aspect. he said one day he gets a call from one of Truman's secretaries saying the president wants to see you in his office pronto, right away. So the aide said, I ran to Truman's office. And when I ran in, sitting there on the chairs and the couch outside of the office was a group of very distinguished men. He said they all had three-piece suits on, straight out of Central Casting. And he said, however, they were so angry, he said that their eyebrows looked like lightning bolts. That's what he said to me. He said, so I told the secretary, I don't know what business the president and I have. I had nothing on my calendar. So these men look important and they look angry. Why don't they go in first? Mine can wait. And the secretary said, nope, the president was clear. He wants you in his office now. So the aide walked in. His name was Ken. And he said that he goes in and Truman says to him, and the aide says to Truman, he says, Mr. President, I don't know what business we have, but there's these important men, blah, 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 blah. You can meet with them. And Truman says, have a seat, Ken. He said, nope, I don't want to talk to them. I want to talk to you. Let me tell you why. He said, when I was heading the Truman Committee in the Senate, he said, one of the businesses that was overcharging the government and stealing from the taxpayer was Chase Bank. He said, so I went to New York City to meet with the board. And he said, the board of directors made me sit outside their office for 1 hour. He said, Ken, get comfortable, because those distinguished and angry men out there, that's the board of Chase. I called them down here. He said, and I'm going to make them wait 1 hour and 1 minute, which he did before he brought him in and he read him the riot act about the contracting fraud. The vice presidential selection. So Truman was picked in 1944 by FDR when FDR was running for his unprecedented 4th term as president. The 22nd Amendment, limiting a president to 2 terms, did not go into effect until after Truman left office, which was January 20th, 1953. So Truman never should have been picked as vice president. He didn't want the vice presidency. He was perfectly happy being in the Senate. What happened was, of course, in recent times, in the last several decades, ever since George McGovern's disastrous selection of Eagleton in 1972, and it came out afterwards that Eagleton had electric shock therapy, and that was a huge scandal. Ever since 72, all presidents have thoroughly vetted their vice presidents. There's vetting, there's background checks, there's interviews. It's a months and months long process that starts before they win the nomination. The only one that wasn't vetted, that was picked willy-nilly, was when McCain picked Sarah Palin. Of course, had she been vetted, there's no way under the sun that she would have been picked for an office such as the vice presidency. But other than her, everybody's been vetted. So back in 44, FDR went to the Democratic convention with his aides. The problem was one, FDR's health was bad. The aides were worried that FDR was going to even live through another term, and FDR recognized his declining health. 2, the vice president, Henry Wallace, was a progressive, a friend of the farmer, a good man. But Henry Wallace had gotten a little kooky by then, and he was almost an apologist for Joe Stalin. He couldn't be counted on to lobby the Senate for votes, which of course is one of the jobs of the vice president. So all the aides knew that Wallace had to go. So FDR told his aides, put together a short list for me. And they put together, if I remember correctly, 7 names on the list. So at the convention, literally, they're sitting at the 4-day-long convention. FDR says, okay, go through the list. The first person on the list, the aides liked, but FDR didn't. Maybe the second one FDR liked, but the aides didn't. Maybe the third one no one liked. As they're going through the list, they're arguing and arguing about everybody. And nobody is pleasing to everyone. But while they're arguing, the aides are almost talking about FDR in past tense. In other words, they're stressing that this is an important pick because of the boss's health. And FDR, of course, has a giant ego, and he's in the room. Finally, on the 6th person, they have a big fight. FDR blows up and says, I'm in the room. I'm going to live through another term. He says, who's the 7th name on the list? Get him on the phone. And they said, Truman from Missouri. They put Truman on the phone. FDR's in the back of the room. The aides are talking. The aides call Truman, who was at the convention at the hotel, and willy-nilly say, the president wants you to accept the nomination for vice president tomorrow at the convention. Truman says, tell him thank you, but no thank you, I'm not interested. Truman wrote that he could hear FDR in the back of the room just cursing and going wild, saying, you tell Truman that if he wants to break up the party in the middle of the war, that's on his legacy. So Truman sheepishly comes back on and says, I accept. And you can see that picture on the right. Bess looks like she's about to faint. Truman is nervous. He didn't want the position. Bess was livid. David McCullough even said that Bess thought about leaving him. She was so angry that she had to become first lady. She wanted nothing to do with politics. On the left is a picture of Truman with FDR. Truman was VP for only 82 days before FDR had his stroke on massive cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945 at Warm Springs, Georgia. So FDR didn't even know Truman. They met a grand total of 2 times. And one of them you're looking at, it was only a photo op. And Truman wrote during that photo op that when FDR tried to drink, he was shaking so badly, he couldn't drink. He couldn't actually serve himself water or whatever they were drinking. And Truman said, I knew then I was going to be president. And if you look at Truman's smile, I've looked at probably, I don't know, all the photographs that have ever been taken on Truman over my 30-year career as a professor. There is not a single one where he's smiling like that. That is not Harry Truman's smile. That is one of those nervous, oh my goodness smiles. So that's how Truman was picked as VP. Never should have been picked, but thank goodness he was. Could you imagine that critical post-war order, all the things that he did without Truman in office? His presidency, he served from from 45 to 53, so served 2 terms. It's one of the most influential presidencies in history, no question. One of the things I like the most about Truman, and here he is in Florida, not far from where I am, he's in Key West with his pith helmet. He told his aides to wear Hawaiian shirts. That was Truman's presidential retreat. He did not use Camp David, which at the time was known as Camp Shangri-La. That's what FDR called it. David would be named by Eisenhower for his grandson, David. He always took his grandson, David, and granddaughter, Susan. And why the heck Ike didn't show gender parity, I'll never know. But Truman went to Key West all the time. There he is doing business. But what's so amazing is all these aides of Truman's, I would ask them, one of the main questions I asked them was, I need you to tell me about Truman's decision-making style. Here's why. If you think of the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, if you think of dropping the bomb, desegregating the military, the creation of NATO, I mean, some of the most momentous decisions in American history. Most presidents will get 1 or 2, maybe 3 if it's a Lincoln, a Washington, or an FDR, major decisions that come across their desk. And, quite frankly, I believe most presidents, when they get that one big decision, they've botched it, including several recent presidents. But Truman has about a dozen major decisions that come across his desk and goes 12 for 12. So I asked his aides, that record will never be met. How did he make a decision? So first off, Truman surrounded himself with Democrats and Republicans. He said he did not want yes men. He did not want bobbleheads. He wanted disagreement. Truman knew that in a democracy, debate, disagreement, and dissent, the 3 Ds of democracy, were essential for governing. And you weren't able to debate, and nay, Truman demanded that you debating. You have permission. This is your president ordering you to debate me, to disagree with me. So Truman created kind of a feuding fraternity with all these aides sitting around with different perspectives, arguing, debating. He would sit them in a room and make everybody weigh in and debate every issue. Everybody had to have skin in the game, disagree with me. And then what he would do when he had a big decision, for example, when he was looking at statehood for Israel, he would always get 2 aides, one to make the pro, one to make the con. For Israel, it was Clark Clifford on the pro and George Marshall on the con. Wow, talk about a clash of the titans. I would love to have been a fly on the wall for that one. And he would make all the aides listen to the debate, and everybody had to weigh in. Then with the poker face, he would tell everyone, you'll have my decision tomorrow. So in addition to hiring a diverse group of people, Democrats and Republicans, demanding skin in the game, demanding debate, Truman read voraciously on the topic. And then the next day, once he had a chance to think about it, sleep on it, he would have everybody meet him at 05:30. He was still always on military time, 5:30 in the morning. And he would say to them, okay, I slept on it. He said, now I think I'm going to do this, but I have one more question for you. And all the aides I interviewed told me the same thing. This would be his question. Now tell me, is this the right thing to do? Because ultimately, it came down to simply, was it the right thing to do or not? And that's how Truman made his decisions. Dropping the bomb in 1945. Truman had intelligence reports that the Americans, that we would lose 250,000 men, the Japanese millions. By dropping the bomb, we lost zero. The math is indisputable. And the Japanese only lost 250,000 instead of millions. Moreover, we ended the war immediately. We need to remember this is the world's bloodiest, world's worst war, and it would have raged on and on during the invasion of Japan. Remember Iwo Jima, we had 26,000 casualties for an insignificant volcanic piece of rock that we bombed back to the Stone Age before we sent the Marines ashore. So this would have been an epic bloodbath. Truman dropped the bomb and saved lives, ended the war. And the proof is in the pudding. Within a year, Japan's feeding itself and became an ally. The Truman Doctrine of 47, we will come to the defense of any country around the world that's threatened by communism. So Truman engages around the world. Truman is basically the president that wrote the book on internationalism, on multilateralism. We work in concert with our allies, so we work together. He was an internationalist, and all presidents since Truman have been, with just two quick exceptions, have been internationalists of both parties. Eisenhower and Bush one, Clinton and Kennedy. I mean, they all have been internationalists who have been multilateralists. George W. Bush could be a bit of a cowboy unilateralist. You're with us or you're against us, I'll go it alone. I don't need your permission to invade or whatever. And then, of course, Donald Trump just shredded the Truman Doctrine and said that the world's laughing at us. And he was an isolationist and a unilateralist, not an internationalist. But basically, every Congress, every president since then had followed Truman's lead on the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan, I think the height of this, Truman saved Europe. And it was not popular at the time, the idea of spending money to rebuild Europe and forgive Germany. Truman said, forgive, yes, forget, no. We will rebuild and save Europe. Now, Truman's the architect of it, but Truman knew that he lacked the stature and international gravitas to get the world to come on board and Europe to listen to us and Congress to shell out billions of dollars to rebuild the world. So that's why he got General Marshall to go to Europe and talk to leaders. Marshall gave the commencement address at Harvard and announced this. Back then, people paid attention to commencement addresses. Today, they text. So it was named for Marshall, showing the great humility and magnanimity that defined Truman, and that saved Western Europe. The Berlin airlift. Of course, as you can see here, Trizonia, you have the British zone, the French zone, the American zone. When in effect, they were all American zones. The Soviets seized part of it. We seized part of it. As you know, we split West and East Germany. The Soviets block water, rail, and road access to Berlin. They're literally going to starve out and let an entire city, population of one of the world's greatest cities, die. Truman says that's unacceptable. The military, as generals say, gas up the tanks and we'll break the blockade. That would have been World War III. The State Department says, just give it up. Nothing we can do. We have to just give up the people of Berlin. Truman says neither position is acceptable. He finds the 50-yard line. We're going to fly airplanes in every few hours, every few minutes eventually, with coal, flour, everything the people of Berlin need to live. And we're going to show the world in a great PR campaign that the Soviets are willing to kill an entire population, and we're willing to move heaven and earth to save it. And that was Truman. One of the aspects that I always liked, and as of about a year or so ago, he was still alive, but I brought this fellow here. I used to convene an annual Harry Truman conference and bring presidential candidates and generals and Truman's aides and all that to it. Brought him in one year. This is Gail Horvison. He was a pilot during the Berlin airlift, and he was known as the candy bomber. And you can see from the picture on the right, in the middle of this critical moment when the Soviets and the Americans are basically staring down gun barrels at one another, the world ready to go to war. Truman's concerned that the kids in Berlin don't have anything. We're flying in flour and tea and coffee and toilet paper. We're not flying in toys and candy. So he gets Gail Horvison to bomb the kids of Berlin with chocolate bars. So he becomes known as the candy bomber. And whenever he would fly in, he'd waggle his wings and kids would just come running from afar to get candy. Only Truman would do that. Civil rights. Truman wanted a civil rights bill after the war, but he was defeated by Republicans and some Southerners. So in 1948, he tries it again. He's defeated again. But what Truman says is, I can start the process by desegregating the military. Executive Order 9981. Truman integrates the military. And in doing so, he sets the tone for what would become the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I had the great opportunity of working with former Congressman John Lewis, Martin Luther King's deputy, on a national conference I convened on civil rights. And he came and he told me one of his heroes was Harry Truman. And John Lewis told me that exactly this. He said, Martin, meaning MLK, Martin used to always say that if it wasn't for Truman, Civil Rights Act never would have passed. Truman got it started. Truman applauded the great heroic contributions of the Black Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo American Indian code talkers during the war, the Japanese Americans from Hawaii and elsewhere of the 442nd Go for Broke, and Jewish Americans. All four groups risked their lives overseas and yet were discriminated against when they came home. Truman would talk about the double V campaign. We need victory in Europe against totalitarianism, but victory for equality here at home. So Truman does that. Statehood for Israel in 1948. Truman is the world's first leader, May 14th, 1948, at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, by the way, to recognize Israel. He also floats Israel a $100 million loan guarantee. He also supports Israel with what today we would call most favored nation trading status. We all know that Israel's neighbors attacked it immediately in 48 through 49. And nobody would trade with, buy from, or sell to Israel. So Truman traded with Israel. Truman provides a joint military training, intelligence sharing, immigration, cultural exchanges, all the things that define this unique relationship between Israel and Truman today. There on the left, you can see Truman with the great Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the intellectual Zionist leader, who became like brothers with Truman. They had a wonderful meeting where Weizmann thanked Truman by presenting him with the Torah, with the scroll. And Truman responded by not being able to pronounce Chaim, C-H-A-I-M. Truman called him Cham. And they laughed, and here's a picture of them laughing when Truman couldn't pronounce Chaim. Weizmann would later call Truman Moses for what he had done. And there's Truman with Ben Gurion and Ambassador Abba Eban, again presenting him with another gift for what they've done. Abba Eban, the 33-year-old ambassador to the world from the fledgling new state of Israel, always considered Truman to be the key ingredient to statehood. And Eban would call Truman the American Cyrus, in reference to Cyrus the Great, 4th, 5th century BCE, the Persian king, not Darius, not Xerxes, it was crazy, but Cyrus was the first to bring Jews back to Jerusalem. So Truman's relationship there. Here on the top right, you can see the Tuskegee Airmen. Bottom left, the contributions from Jewish Americans. Top left, the 442nd from Japan. Bottom left, the Navajo code talkers, the people I mentioned to. I want to end by just, I'm going to skip this for the sake of time and just bring this thing to a close. Somehow Truman managed to win in 1948 against all obstacles. Dewey should have won, but Dewey was lazy. He would give one public appearance a day. He was coasting because everybody said he would win. He was giving these vacuous speeches. One of Dewey's speeches, he used the line, he said, "That which is behind us is the past. and that which is before us is the future. What is that? Truman crisscrossed the country on the Ferdinand Magellan. You can see his train on the lower left. Went to every town with one stop sign, crisscrossed the heartland, and gave roaring speeches from the back of the train, speaking truth to power, reminding people that he was one of them. I interviewed two of Truman's speechwriters from the Whistle Stop campaign in '48. They told me that Truman sent them to cities before the train. And they went to every little town, I should say, every little town, community. And he told them to find out what's the local high school football team's record? How is the fall harvest? What's the main crop? What is it selling for? And every town has a soldier and a statue in a town square. Who's the soldier? Now, with his photographic memory, Truman's train would roll up. You can see the massive crowds. Everybody wanted to come out and meet Harry. There he is in the top left, speaking from the back of the train. Now, imagine being a farmer. You never met the president. You never saw a president. Here's a president coming to your town, and this is what he would say. If you vote for me, I'm going to give them hell the way your high school football team did last weekend when you beat Thomas Jefferson High 14-7. You know, people are probably thinking, how does this guy know this? Then he would say, I heard things are tough. I was a farmer too. What are you getting? I heard you're only getting so much per bushel of corn or wheat or whatever. And he would talk to them about farming, and because he was a farmer and he had failed as well. And then he would say to them, I want you to know that I honor you. And I was a veteran. I honor the military. I honor soldiers. I honor POWs, unlike some presidents. And he would say to them, he said, if you elect me, I will remember the contributions of your hero. And he would tell them about the statue that was downtown. And he would laugh and wave and say, give him hell and go to the next town. So Truman managed to win. Just going to go to the end, the legacy, and say what's remarkable is Truman was very unpopular when he was president. The very first Gallup poll, which was the first poll measuring presidential approval, was taken in 1933. From 33 until today, the president with the all-time lowest ranking was not Nixon, not Carter, not Nixon on the eve of Watergate, not W after Hurricane Katrina, not Trump. It was Truman, 22%. Shouldn't have won re-election. When he left office, one prominent historian wrote that Truman was one of the worst presidents in history and easily the worst of the 20th century, forgetting that Harding and Coolidge and Hoover are part of the 20th century. So Truman was not popular. Truman was asked about this when he left office. He said, I don't worry. He said, I have great confidence in the American people. NATO and firing MacArthur and dropping the bomb and the Marshall Plan. All these decisions were difficult and they were unpopular and people were angry with me. But you give the public 20 years. You watch, he said. 20 years, they'll come around to seeing the wisdom of all I've done. You know what? About 20 years later, Truman rose from failure to the heights of these presidential approval polls. I've had the great honor for about the past, almost, I guess, 18, 19 years of being one of the historians that they pick every year to do the rankings. And Truman has been up to around number 5 in the presidential rankings, behind only Lincoln, Washington, and both Roosevelts. Today, everybody loves Harry. Everybody realizes what a great president and what a remarkable man. They broke the mold. Honest, incapable of lying, friendly with everybody, made the right decisions. Just a remarkable president. I think he really is the epitome of greatness and leadership in high office. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, let me come back on screen. Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
My pleasure.
Let me see here. Okay. Okay, there we are. Okay, that was great, really great. You skipped the slide about MacArthur. Do you want to talk about that decision?
Yeah.
It was controversial at the time.
Yeah, I interviewed Truman's aides and asked them about which decisions did Truman get the most heat for. the most hate mail, which you can track in the Truman Presidential Library, the most angry phone calls, the most members of Congress that were angry. One of them was statehood for Israel. It was clearly one of them. But one of them was firing MacArthur. Remember, MacArthur was adored. He was beloved. He was America's hero. I always thought he was an overrated peacock, quite frankly. But MacArthur, in the Korean War, he has his brilliant landing at Incheon. You have the Korean Peninsula, and everybody figured, and the communists drove the Korean people down to the bottom of the peninsula. They're facing a Dunkirk-like evacuation. They're going to drive the people into the water. Everybody thought MacArthur would land at the bottom and reinforce everybody. Instead, he sails around the peninsula, comes in from a high end, and a pincer move destroys the communists. That was brilliant. But he was told, do not go above the midpoint, today the 38th parallel. He violated that. He was told that by the Joint Chiefs. He was told, do not go to Pyongyang. He went to Pyongyang. He was told, do not go all the way to the Yalu River. That's what separates Korea, the Korean Peninsula, from China. If you do that, you could bring China into the war. What did MacArthur do? Went to the Yalu. MacArthur violated 3 orders from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Truman comes in and gives several orders. MacArthur violates and ignores the orders from the commander-in-chief. Then he starts bad-mouthing Truman to the press, and MacArthur asks for battlefield control of our atomic arsenal, which is, it's lunacy. To give you an idea, and MacArthur, his foolishness resulted in thousands of Americans dying at the Yalu. So Truman wants to meet MacArthur. MacArthur won't meet with Truman. Truman has to fly to Wake Island. The president should not go to his general. It should be the other way around. MacArthur meets Truman, as you could see from that slide, not in his dress uniform. Wendy, he had his aviator glasses, no tie on, and that frumpy hat instead of his regulation. You don't meet the president that way. He was disrespectful. Truman said, I'm firing MacArthur because we have to assert civilian control over the military and the chain of command. We cannot have a rogue general. And he fired him. His aides begged Truman not to do it. They said, let the Joint Chiefs fire MacArthur, or at least have them stand behind you when you do it. Truman said, I would never pass the buck to someone when I should make the decision, nor would I use a man in uniform as a prop. Wow, that's telling for today. So Truman fires MacArthur, but the way he fires it, I interviewed one of his aides who was the point person on MacArthur, and this is what the aide told me. You'll love this story, Wendy and everyone. The aide said that at the end of the workday, he got a call to hustle down and see Truman. It was the end of the day, 5, 6 o'clock. And Truman said, I need you to go to the Library of Congress right now. And I need you to find every book you can on how Lincoln fired General McClellan. And then Truman knows all the books. Get Carl Sandburg, he's all the classics. I mean, who knows this except, leading historians. So the aide says, why? And Truman says, just go do it. And then have the report to me at 5:30 in the morning. Everything's 5:30. The aide runs to the Library of Congress. He's reading all these books. The Library of Congress closes, Wendy. The aide told me he hid in the stacks in the dark. You couldn't do that today. And he said then he stole the books and ran out the door in the middle of the night. It'd be locked today or a sound system would go off. He said, I ultimately returned the books. He said, because I had to work all night long, I went in at 5:30 and gave Truman the report on how Lincoln fired the peacock, General George McClellan, who wouldn't listen to Lincoln during the war. McClellan wouldn't attack. He disrespected Lincoln. He badmouthed Lincoln. At one point, Lincoln had to write a funny letter to McClellan saying, General, if you're not using your army, might I borrow it? So Truman then says to the aide, he says, thank you. This is exactly what I thought. Come with me. Truman then announces to all of his aides, he says, during the Civil War, Lincoln fired McClellan because McClellan thought he should be running the war. McClellan ignored his president. He thought his president was a Midwestern clod who lacked military experience, and he, McClellan, should be the next president. So Lincoln fired him. He said, ladies and gentlemen, he said, MacArthur thinks he should be running the war. He doesn't listen to his president. He thinks I'm a Midwestern clod, and he wants to be the next president. Perfect historical parallel. He put himself on safe ground with Lincoln, and he fired MacArthur. Today, Wendy, you cannot find a serious historian that would disagree with Truman firing MacArthur, although he took a lot of heat at the time.
Great. Okay, we have some really good questions from the audience, so let me go through those. We have a lot of compliments also, which I'll send to you after. Okay, you are impressed with Truman's honesty and integrity. Any idea how or if his family and Missouri upbringing resulted in these admirable character traits? I think that's a really, really interesting question. How did someone who came from such a humble background have such a wide, embracing worldview?
Yeah. Well, there you go. There's the $1,000,000 question. And thank you for that wonderful question. So first off, I think Wendy answered part of it by saying Truman grew up with such a humble upbringing, hard scrabble. As a kid, he was not good at sports. He couldn't see. He was picked on and bullied. Where some people, like Woodrow Wilson, kind of developed a chip on his shoulder, Truman became a rock. He could handle anything. Part of it was Truman's service in World War I. You know, he didn't rise all the way up to the rank of general. And I think if you look at Washington or Grant or Eisenhower, or any of these folks, these men that served in the military, they knew that war is hell. And they developed a healthy dose of perspective and humility. Truman didn't rise that high up, which meant that Truman actually killed people and saw men die. Therefore, he came back from the war and said, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to being a champion for those who need a champion and fighting against the evil that men can do. So that made him honorable and honest and temperate. Truman also had a remarkable array of close Jewish friends as a young man. Now, how do you find close Jewish friends if you're in rural Missouri 100 years ago? I don't know, but he did. And he was very aware of the historic persecution against the Jewish people. Truman was not at all religious, but he loved the Old Testament and had a photographic memory and read it over and over. So he always would say, I know all about the persecution, but I also know about the promise. So understanding the persecution that his close friends felt, I think tempered him and weighed on him. Truman was also a voracious reader. The last president to lack a college degree, but he was a bibliophile. The guy read and read and read and read and read the right stuff. I could tell you 100 stories of aides saying that Truman would be debating an issue with them, and he would be talking about Rousseau or Montesquieu or Plato or Aristotle. He read it. He read this, and a failed farmer from rural Missouri. So one aide told me that he went into Truman's office one day before Truman was supposed to give a speech on the radio, and he was supposed to practice the speech. He said Truman was sitting at his desk reading a biography of Charlemagne. And then he was talking about Charlemagne's influence on Europe in medieval times. I mean, this is just crazy. Oh, here's a good one. Truman's grandson, Clifton, his oldest grandson, who is a dear, dear friend of mine. He said, when I was a little boy, he said, I went downstairs one day and Grandpa sitting down there, of course, first thing in the morning, reading the newspaper. He said, so I snuck by Grandpa. I wanted to go watch the cartoons. He said, and I thought I got by, but from behind the newspaper, I hear Grandpa say, you don't want to do that. Those are cartoons. Come sit with me. I'll read to you. So he picks up a book and is reading it. And Clifton's like 5. And Truman's reading this book to him. And Clifton said, I'm miserable. It's Saturday morning. Fortunately, Clifton was saved by his mother, Margaret, who comes down the stairs and just starts yelling, Dad, what are you doing? Truman was reading Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, to his 5-year-old grandson. So Truman was very well read. Therefore, as an historian myself, I always say, first off, it's hard to not be an alcoholic if you're an historian, because the horrors of history. Every culture, every time period, people just do the worst to one another. But as an historian, I always think that I'm very tempered in my judgment, my decision making, because I realize what has happened. So all those things together, I think, made Truman who he was. And I would add one to it. I have a whole other list, but for the sake of time, and I've said this, for 30 years at national conferences in front of historians and so forth. Harry Truman just simply had a moral compass. He was one of these guys who would reach down inside himself when he had to make a difficult decision. And when he got a hold of that moral compass, Wendy, he didn't let go. As I said a moment ago, is it the right thing to do? And that's just a special trait that I don't know that any upbringing, any book can forge that kind of leadership. And you find it in where did George Washington develop his heroic temperament? I mean, this guy grew up with nothing. Lincoln never stepped foot in a school. And look at, so every once in a while we have a fluke of greatness that comes along at just the right time.
Okay. So you spoke about his distaste for the horrors of war and trying to avoid it at all costs. We have a really interesting question about, did Truman understand the dangers of radioactivity? According to a new book, Fallout, it was kept from reporters and the public until Hershey's Hiroshima was published in the New Yorker. And so what do you know about that?
No, of course, the atomic bomb was new, right? There had been some testing, but it was all very new. Sort of like this, COVID pandemic. We're still figuring out the science. We know a lot. The pandemic, the vaccines are extraordinary, but we're still figuring it out. This was a new technology. Truman was not a scientist. He was the type of person that demanded complete, unlike, some presidents won't read anything that's given to them and won't study anything and won't listen to anyone. Truman read everything, and Truman brought the best of the best around and wanted them to debate. So he was prepped, but we still didn't know. He knew it would be horrible, but we didn't know the extent of it. So no, he wasn't. But what he did know was that intelligence reports showed that we thought Japan had no aircraft, no Air Force remaining, when in fact we had cracked their code and intercepted intelligence that Japan was keeping just enough planes back. Each one had one bomb, just enough fuel to get airborne, and a kamikaze pilot. If we had anchored 300 ships off the coast, and think of D-Day, there's that incredible, those pictures of hundreds of ships as far as the eye can see. But we had taken the Normandy beaches, and fortunately the Nazi Navy and the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine were on their knees by then, so we could land at will. Not so in Japan. They had planes back just for the purpose of protecting their beaches if we landed. It would have been a bloodbath. We also knew that the Japanese were giving young boys a vial of a poison, a hand grenade. Women were given a sharp bamboo stick. And they said, when GIs come up to you, you pull the hand grenade. Or the women were supposed to stab men where the breastplate right under your chest, where it opens up, because that's soft. And the invasion of Japan, remember, years after the war, Wendy, we were finding half-naked, half-starved Japanese soldiers in Pompeii, Koshrai, Chuk, Palau, all across the Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, still fighting the war. Remember, in Iwo Jima, people jumped off cliffs rather than surrender. When we had people in Japanese yelling into caves that we are going to light this cave up with a flamethrower, the Japanese took death rather than to come out. If they had fought to the last man, woman, and child, this would have been a bloodbath of epic proportions. So Truman did not know all about the atomic bomb. He knew it would be horrific. But and I say this, there's only one nightmare more horrific than the idea of unleashing the atomic or nuclear beast or genie. And that would have been the bloodbath had we gone ashore in Japan. And this thing would have raged another year, would have cost countless lives, more millions and billions of dollars. And we need to take ourselves back to 1945, everybody. It's easy for us today say, don't drop it. And of course, I'm a nuclear non-proliferation guy. I've written about it. I organize rallies. I used to have a newspaper column and a Sunday morning TV show. I've talked about it ad nauseum. But coming out of World War II, you've got to end the war. So.
Okay. Very good explanation. Thank you. So let me try and get through some of these questions. Okay. So it appears that things were different enough back in the day that he was able to walk around Washington with very little security. Interesting. Truman attended Tom Pendergast's funeral.
Yeah.
And received criticism for attending.
Let me hit those two real quickly. Yes and yes. Truman loved to walk, and he hated Secret Service. And he would always tell anybody, if you're going to walk with me, you have to keep up with me. One of the games he liked to play was to try to tire the press out. Truman was in the war, and the rest of his life, he went for a walk every day, and he counted his steps like they did in basic training in World War I. So however many steps per minute, he counted them in his head. So he was in shape, and he could walk, he could go. So he did that everywhere. He hated Secret Service around. There are in the Truman Library thousands of letters from people that said they were in New York City or in Missouri or wherever. And they said Truman would go walking down the road and, how are you? And what's your name? And hi, Wendy. You know, and he would wave the people, and as nice as the day is long. He went to Pendergast's funeral. Now that would be like a president today going to a mafioso, like John Gotti's funeral or whatever. Although President Trump pardoned, numerous felons and basic mafia kingpins, some of the most corrupt people in the country. So I guess it's not unprecedented. But of course, Truman shouldn't have gone to the funeral, but he went. And the people were yelling at him when he was walking into the funeral. The press was yelling for questions. People were hissing. And when Truman, and his aides begged him not to go, but he said Pendergast was a bad man, but he was my friend. I have to go. He was loyal to a fault. When Truman walked in, Wendy, he delivered the best line. He walks in and turns to the crowd that's booing him. And this is what he said: love the sinner, hate the sin. And he walked in. Pendergast was a bad man, but he was my friend.
Okay. There are several, there's a lot, there are two themes to the questions I'm seeing now. One is questioning, why was the second bomb needed if the disaster and war seemed, the Japanese, giving up was imminent?
So we didn't have cell phones or the kind of technology we have today. Transportation, communication were rudimentary and primitive. So first off, we need to wait several days whether we're going to drop the second bomb or not, for Japan to digest the horrors of what had just happened. And of course, there's the whole targeting issue. We don't want to pick a populated city, but you don't want to pick a rural area, because you hit a rural area, it doesn't get Japan's attention. Remember, Japan was willing to starve its entire population and just murder a generation of people. So if you don't, if you're fighting Goliath and you kick him in the shin, you don't have his attention, right? And we also had to hit manufacturing places that could produce. This is what we did when we carpet bombed in Austria and Germany. We hit military production targets, ditto in Japan. So Truman hit him. He ordered before the bombing that we leaflet. He sent messages to, Tojo, to Hirohito, to the Japanese hierarchy, surrender, otherwise something horrible is going to happen. We leafleted, telling the people, get out of your cities, beg to your leaders, something's going to happen. And the response from Japan was basically F you in Japanese. So we hit him. So Truman says, we'll wait. We waited 3 days. That's enough time to digest the horrors. We sent another message, additional leafleting, surrender. The response was basically absolutely not. So we hit him again. Now we only had 2 bombs, but Truman was a poker player. So he let Japan believe that he had many more, and that every few days until the end of time, we're going to just annihilate it. And he gave him a few days after the second, and guess what? It worked. They surrendered. We saved lives. We ended the world's worst war, and we lost not a single American. One of Truman's most senior advisors, his name was George Elsie, remarkable man, a naval intelligence commander who ran the map room for FDR and Churchill in World War II. Imagine the stories this guy could tell me. I still have goosebumps thinking about it. He told me, George Elsie told me, if Truman had not dropped the bomb, he would have been impeached after the war. If we found out after the war that we buried 250,000 sons and husbands when we had a way to end the war without a single loss of life. When we spent a year of dragging on the war, when we could have ended it instantaneously, the country would have impeached him. Okay. So there's another way to look at it.
Okay. Another theme of the questions that I'm seeing, and this is at least half a dozen, things like, isn't it true that his wife Bess was anti-Semitic? Isn't it true that his family was racist? What about the racist language and views that later emerged? How does all this, factor in with his support of civil rights? So
yes and yes for the first two. Truman's wife, I believe, was anti-Semitic. His mother-in-law was a rabid anti-Semite, Mama Wallace, Madge Wallace. It was horrible. His own family, his parents and grandparents, were racist and anti-Semitic. The Trumans were unreconstructed Confederates. They really were. They were racist, anti-Semitic people, which to me makes Truman all the more special. Can you teach an old dog new tricks? With Truman, you could. Truman's record on civil rights speaks for itself. It's one of the most extraordinary. The fact that Martin Luther King and John Lewis considered Truman a hero, enough said, right? Truman's record on Israel was extraordinary. He had an unprecedented number of Jewish advisors and aides working for him, some of which I interviewed when I interviewed him years later. Truman's work for Israel, as I said, and I'm a big Abba Eban fan, and Eban considered Truman a father figure. Eban said to Truman that generations of Jewish children unborn will consider you to be the father. Eban told Truman that next to the names Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, Noah, Moses will be the name Truman. And this is, for what this man did. So Truman's best friend was a Jew, Eddie Jacobson.
So how does, but this doesn't make sense in a way that he would be so close with and so in love with his wife who held such vile beliefs. And how was he able to compartmentalize?
I agree. Truman outgrew his upbringing, which I love. I grew up in a family of steel mill workers in Steelton, Pennsylvania, part of Harrisburg near Hershey, some of whom went to the 4th grade or 6th grade, and I one of the things I'm proud about my life is that I went and got a PhD and I write books. But I've never forgotten where I came from, and I'm proud of it. And I tried to transcend my upbringing, as I think some people do. And Harry Truman did. Now, love is blind, Wendy, and and I'm the first person to admit I don't understand it at all.
Okay.
I don't get it. But Harry was wild about Bess. He worshiped the ground she walked on, and she was a racist anti-Semite. And Truman's best friend was Jewish, and Truman risked. He didn't just do all this for civil rights in Israel. He risked his presidency. There are so many cases I can tell you. I've read them. I've held with gloves on. I've held the letters in my hand and read them, where Truman tells his aides, he says, I'm good. And quote, here's one of them. Here's a verbatim. And all the quotes I gave you are verbatim. I always memorize quotes. Every quote I gave you was verbatim. And one of his quotes at the 48th convention, when they read Truman's platform for aggressive civil rights, statehood for Israel, and all this aid and support for Israel, there was a booing on the floor, and Southern Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond, South Carolina's delegation, walked out of the convention in frustration of Truman's civil rights. And Truman wrote in his diary that night, this is a verbatim quote, he said, in doing these, civil rights promoting Israel, in doing these, I will lose the White House. So be it. It's the right thing to do. So, I have friends who I don't understand for the life of me how she married this guy. And I don't understand for the life how he married her, right? But love is a strange creature. Now, Truman had some colorful language, but I think we need to go back 100 and some years to rural Missouri, and this is the way people talked. Truman loved an off-color joke. at the expense of people. But, I admit, I've devoted much of my 30-year career, to civil rights, to fighting against, I've won awards for fighting against anti-Semitic violence. I've written about it. I do rallies for same-sex equality. Yet I admit if Chris Rock or, Kevin Hart has a comedy show, I laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. So I guess it's complicated, but Truman's record speaks for itself on these matters.
Okay, all right. It was just
No,
interesting. It was
questions.
interesting that so many people were making the same comments.
Yep, it's true.
Here's an easy one. How good of an actual poker player was he?
He was a very good poker player. Truman played poker all the time and usually won. I'll give you one quick example when he didn't win. So Truman and Winston Churchill are meeting for the first time and to design the West's response to the Cold War. Okay, so this is one of the most important meetings in history. And they're on the Ferdinand Magellan, and Truman arranges for Churchill to deliver the commencement address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. So they're on the train going to the commencement, and Truman and Churchill are drinking with all Truman's aides. And I interviewed one of the aides that was there. He said, we were playing poker, and he said, by midnight, we were pickled. He said, people were so drunk that we were all blind. He said, the prime minister, Truman, all of us. He said, Churchill gets up to go pee, to hit the head, as he said, the military term. He said, as soon as Churchill walked out of the room, Truman becomes sober. And he looks around at every aide and he says, the prime minister is down several $100s. The next one of you that wins a hand of cards, you're fired. He said, I want the prime minister to go to bed tonight up several $100s. The future of the transatlantic alliance is at stake. So what they do is they open up additional decks of cards and they all have extra kings and queens. They're slipping them to Churchill. Churchill is so drunk, he doesn't realize it. They play another couple of hands until Churchill's up. Truman loses on purpose. And then Truman, once Churchill's up, he sends all the aides to bed. Truman and Churchill sit up all night long working on Churchill's speech. Wendy, in the morning is when Churchill went in and gave us the Iron Curtain speech, one of the greatest speeches in history, where he and Truman design what would basically be the Marshall Plan, NATO and the West's response to, and they did. And in the morning, the aide told me, when Truman and Churchill walked on stage, he said they were giggling, they were burping, they were so drunk. And he said they sat on the platform with all the university administrators. They said they reeked, they smelled so bad. And drunk, Churchill got up and gave one of the most important and greatest speeches in history.
That is a great story.
Yeah, I love it. Truman was a great poker player.
That's how was Truman? Do you have a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. How was? Can you talk about Truman's relationship with Eisenhower? Was there any relationship?
Oh, great question. So Truman's relationship with Eisenhower, you need a marriage therapist or a psychologist to figure it out. They were on again, off again, on again, off again, on it. They were the old couple that couldn't live with one another or live without one another, even though no one in this audience understands that reference. So at one point, Eisenhower had an affair with his British model driver, Kay Summersby, during the war. Truman was loyal to Bess, and Truman was a moral stick in the mud. Truman was going to fire Eisenhower. He was so angry at him over that. Eisenhower and Truman both thought Jack Kennedy was a playboy. So they got together on that in opposing John Kennedy. Although Truman would later realize that Kennedy was a good president. But he didn't think he was ready to be president. And I agree. I think Kennedy was no way ready to be president, but grew nicely into it. And I always rank him as clearly above average. So Truman and Ike were on again, off again, on again, off again, on again, on. And at one point, Joe McCarthy, the drunk Republican senator from Wisconsin, was, red baiting, right? Accusing people, ruining people's lives. People were arrested, they lost their jobs, and he had no evidence. Everybody was a commie. McCarthy was so literally, he wasn't drunk, but figuratively drunk on power that he went after General George Marshall. Marshall, Truman used to say Marshall was the greatest living American. He said he was the embodiment of George Washington. Marshall was a great, great man. And when McCarthy went after Marshall, Truman was livid. Truman was one of the few politicians that didn't cower around Joe McCarthy. There's a wonderful, I read in the Truman archives, a press conference where Truman is just hammering McCarthy. This man's less patriotic than the people he accused. This man isn't, worthy of even mentioning the flag. This man's, he's not a real patriot. And one of the reporters interrupts Truman's rant and says, "Mr. President, you do realize this is a press conference and you're on the record." And Truman says, "Print it, print every word of it." He didn't cower about McCarthy. So Eisenhower refuses to take on McCarthy because Ike doesn't want to upset the hawkish, rabid right part of his party. And Truman contacts Eisenhower and says, General George Marshall was the one that told FDR to hire you as our Army Chief of Staff. And Truman said, if you don't defend Marshall, I'm done with you. And no, I didn't. So yeah.
Who was Truman's vice president?
Alvin Barkley in his second term. He finished FDR's first term with no vice president, believe it or not. Then his second term, it was Alvin Barkley.
And wasn't it a result of that situation? No, or was it with Kennedy that they created the amendment?
So there are
succession.
Okay, so the presidential succession goes all the way back to the 1790s, but it was different than today. It was under Truman. Truman's the one who amended the Presidential Succession Act. If the president dies, it's vice president. If they both die, it used to go to the cabinet in order that the cabinet offices were created. So Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, because Washington hired Jefferson and Hamilton first, then Secretary of War, now Defense, then Attorney General, all the way through all 15 cabinet offices. Truman felt that we should have people that were elected. So it's president, vice president, then Speaker of the House and President pro tem, then the cabinet. So Truman's the one that amended it and put that in by us. What happened was at Kennedy's inauguration in '61, both Truman and Ike as living presidents were sitting behind him. What their aides did is they knew that Truman and Ike respected one another and they kept having these ridiculous spats. So the aides purposely had one of the two of them, their car left without them. So the two of them were forced to ride together. And I'm happy to say on that ride, they patched up the relationship. And when Ike died a few years later, the two of them were friends. So at least when they passed, they were friends.
Okay. How could Truman go through his first term if he was appointed president? He was signed in as president on the 82nd day of Roosevelt's fourth term. How could he go the rest, the majority of almost 4 years without a vice president?
I know.
That is a catastrophic mistake.
That's crazy. So Truman, he finished all of FDR's first term except 82 days, then had his second term. The 22nd Amendment did not come into effect until later, so Truman theoretically could have had a third term, although he wouldn't have been elected. Now, remember this, William Henry Harrison was the first president to die in office in 1841, John Tyler, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He finished his term without a vice president. When Lincoln was shot and Andrew Johnson finished his term, he didn't have a vice president. When Garfield was shot in 81, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, didn't ever pick the vice president. When McKinley died, he was shot in 1901. Teddy Roosevelt finished, he didn't have a vice president. When Harding, so there's a long history that.
Yeah, but it's a bad policy.
I agree, it's a terrible policy. Truman thought it was a terrible policy. And here's what Truman did. The vice president should be more powerful and they should be briefed. Truman realized he was not briefed on anything when he became the president. Alvin Barkley was the first vice president in American history in 1949 to attend all the presidential briefings and intelligence things. Truman even designed the seal of the office of the vice president to try to make it more. Truman wanted to get a vice president. He was so unpopular, and Southerners were so angry at him for civil rights, Israel, and everything else. Republicans were so furious with Truman, he never could have gotten a vice president approved. Never. He had to wait until he ran for election. So yes, Wendy, you're correct. Your questioners are correct. Terrible policy. He should have had it. Truman realized it. So I always say, and one of my former PhD students, who's now a professor at West Point, wrote the definitive book on the vice presidency, and we both agreed the modern vice presidency started with Truman, because he's the one that made Barclay be prepped, briefed, and he always said we always need a vice president because the office is too dangerous. It's crazy. You're absolutely right. It's absolutely crazy.
Wow. Truman was obviously intellectually curious and intelligent. Did he not go to college because of finances, or was it just not an important thing to do?
So Truman was clearly an intellectual. He was not articulate. Truman was not, not a great orator. Eisenhower was a terrible public speaker. Ike was no intellectual either, but he was no dummy, like people say. He was in between. FDR was smart, but not a soaring intellectual, but FDR had the gift of gab. He was a great rhetorician. Then you have people like Lincoln, who was both an intellectual and articulate. And you have people like Trump, who are I'm not being mean, but I mean, he's dumb and inarticulate. So you have all sides of that. Biden's mediocre and inarticulate. Obama was smart and articulate. It doesn't. So Truman was an intellectual and was extremely well read. He was a voracious reader. He read everything he could get his hands on, photographic memory. He surrounded himself with intellectuals. He surrounded himself with Democrats and Republicans. He demanded people debate. So Truman, he did it the right way. Why didn't he go to college? Number one, the family was dirt poor. Number two, they were living in rural Missouri. Number three, he started school. He was going to go to a night school in Kansas City. His father ran the farm and also paved roads for the city. His father has a massive stroke. Truman has to quit his job. He was a bank teller. He has to quit his job and run the farm. And then after 10 years, it goes belly up and start to build the roads. So one of those things where family emergency, lack of money, struggling family where nobody went to school and it just wasn't valued. Again, Truman, to his credit, his goal as a young man, he wanted to go to West Point. So he not only wanted to go to school, he wanted to go to a great college, but it would never be the case. He would never go to school. Yeah.
So just wrapping up, and this has been so interesting and so fascinating. I get the feeling that, and we did talk about this beforehand, that somebody like him, as real as he is, would not be able to be elected now. That there's just too much financial pressure and too many lobbying influencers, and which is kind of a shame, because he was clearly his own person and had a lot of confidence in his ability to make a decision. Did he ever second guess himself after he slept on a decision, checked in with his staff again, made the decision? Were there any, did he look back? Was he, self-reflective like that?
He wrote more than one time, a couple of times, he wrote that I never second guessed a decision I made. Now, is that true, or did he just write it for, I don't know. I asked his aides that exact question, and they said he never second guessed it. I said, was that just for the public? And they wouldn't answer the question. Truman was reflective, introspective. He was one of the very few presidents in history who said, I made a mistake, I apologize. In fact, Obama did that a handful of times. Grant did it often. Lincoln did it a few times, and Truman did it often. I can't think of anybody else that regularly would just say, I made a mistake, it's on me. But Truman did that. So, and in fact, one of the aides I interviewed, when I asked them, you know, did he ever make you laugh? Did he ever make you, was he funny? One of them said I was angry with him because Truman had made a mistake and he was going to go announce to the public that he made a mistake. And the aide said, nobody knows you did it. Nobody knows this. Why tell them? He said, don't. And Truman said, no, I have to. I made a mistake. I've got to tell them. The aide said, this is ridiculous. Nobody. And the aide said, I was so angry at him that Truman went and told people he made a mistake. So Truman wrote a few times that he never second guessed anything, but knowing Harry as I do, and knowing all I know about, I think he probably thought long and hard about some of the decisions and probably wondered if he couldn't have done a better job. That was in his nature. Would he get elected today? No, absolutely not. What's sad is I don't believe Washington, Lincoln, or Truman, three of the greatest leaders we've ever had, if not the greatest, would ever get elected today, in part because of their personality, in part because all three compromised, unlike Congress today. All three were willing to compromise, but not on matters of principle. All three were honest. All three demanded a lot of people. Could they, you know, there are a number of cases with if anybody's heard of the Newburgh conspiracy in March of 1783, or there was a Philadelphia mutiny on June 20th, 1783, just like the January 6th insurrection, where a bunch of fake patriots attacked the building the Congress was in and busted out the windows, tried to grab. George Washington pardoned everybody. He shouldn't have. There were a couple of cases where the military was going to put a man to death, soldier to death for like falling asleep on guard duty, and Lincoln pardoned him. Truman pardoned people. Truman apologized for America making mistakes with American Indians and other things. So all three of them could apologize, could although do that, they could compromise, but I think they were too honest. And you can't even imagine George Washington or Truman sitting down with a lobbyist or somebody saying, you know, some, you know, big casino owner dropping $1 million on them, telling them the gut regulations for the average worker. Inconceivable, inconceivable. And we have enough examples of your Washingtons, Lincolns, and Trumans really going to bat for the common person, really putting matters of principle ahead of what we would today call public opinion. So I don't think any of that, and I'll leave you with this. I've got a lot of friends who are professors of political science or history or write on the presidents. And, you know, I go to all the academic conferences and speak, and there's a group of maybe 30 of us. We always get together for the very non-professorial Mexican and margaritas. And I always ask everybody questions. Who was the smartest presidents? Who were the dumbest? Who were the most honest? Who were the most corrupt? Who had the best marriage? Who had the worst? Who were the most overrated? And, you know, we're nerdy. So over way too many margaritas and way too much Mexican food all night, we go around the table, and these are all people with a lot of books. So it's not scientific, but, you know, but these are, you know, and I ask them these kind of questions. And I did ask them at one point, which great leaders from history could never get elected today? And they all agreed, everybody around the table, Lincoln, Washington, and Truman would never get elected today. So, which really, I think, is an indictment of where the body politic is today, and the body is, you know, I'll leave you with this thought. As bad as Congress is, it's simply a big mirror by which we're looking at ourselves. People are electing these people, and Congress wouldn't fail to act on climate change or, you know, deport little children if it wasn't popular among a good part of the public. So I think that statement about Truman, George Washington.
Oh, wait. Can I just push back on that a little bit? I mean, what about gun control? I reportedly, the majority of people feel
80% of the country wants gun control, but a member of Congress is willing to take millions of dollars from one lobby organization, but the people in that member's district will not hold him or her accountable for going against public opinion and doing that. I hold my members of my elected officials from city council all the way up. I hold them accountable for everything. But the constituents are not holding them accountable for not giving us common sense background check on machine guns outside of elementary schools.
Yeah.
We as a country,
Fred
80%
Fred
safe-
Gutenberg spoke to us a few months ago.
80% of the country wants some kind of gun control, but we as a nation have years ago decided that we are okay with an elementary school being shot up on a regular basis. With school, with movie theaters, with grocery stores being shot on a regular basis. So these members of Congress that vote that way, if their constituents rose up and voted them out, you'd see a change, but the people aren't voting them out. So I think the ultimate blame rests with us. We the people.
Thank you. What is your recommendation for the best book on Harry Truman?
Well, I'd like to say mine, but I would say David McCullough's Truman. David McCullough's Truman is magnificent. He's won the Pulitzer. It's magnificent because McCullough doesn't focus on interest rates. He reveals the man. It's a character study, so it's wonderful. So I would recommend wholeheartedly David McCullough's Truman. It's the best book on the topic. I'd also recommend my brand new book, still has the new car smell. It's on George Washington. It's
George Washington's
Final
Battle. Great.
Real well for me. It's at all the major book festivals. You can get it anywhere online. It's been presented at the Pentagon, the Smithsonian, the National Archives, the Library of Congress. So it's my new book on George Washington. And what I do in there is I try to peel back the layers of the onion to reveal the real George Washington. I'll just simply say that Washington, of all the, and great man, Washington of all the founding fathers, I believe, Wendy, is the least knowable. Why? Washington, over the last 200 years, he comes across the pages of history, let me know if you agree, as more myth than man. He's more monument than flesh and blood. So I wanted to peel back that and not make him a monument or a myth. And who was he? And he was very complicated. He was a politician. But much of Washington, I always say when I write a book on these people, I always like them less. But there's only a few exceptions. I like Harry more. I like Lincoln more. I like Hamilton more. I like Grant more. And Washington, I was worried about it. After spending all that time and writing 400 pages on him, I like him more. So everybody else I like less.
That's great. People, thank you so much. There's about 200 of us who have hung in here, and this was just a fabulous, fabulous lecture. Folks, this is our last lecture for the summer. We're taking the month of August off. We're back in September with David Shack, who's going to be giving us a great lecture on women in comedy. And I also want to, and I believe that the schedule for the fall lectures, we have 8 lectures coming up in the fall. Those are posted on our website now, or will be posted very shortly, so you can start making your reservations. And Dr. Watson is coming back on December 7th to talk to us about
I think it's about Pearl Harbor.
Yes, thank you. I knew.
I think we're doing
the words were like right on the top of my tongue. Yes, the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So that's going to be a nice bookend to our discussion today. Dr. Watson, this has been just a pleasure. My mother raves about you, and she said you have to contact him. So
hello.
I will. Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Levy Senior Center Foundation. Folks, be safe, wear your masks, and we'll see you back here in September. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.